This story is titled, Dad Kicked Me Out So My Golden Child Half-Brother Could Move In, but 6 months later, they are begging me to lie to cover up his crime, or they will go to jail. Hey everyone! Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Alright, so let me set the stage for you. I'm Kyle, 18 male, the unwanted son, the scapegoat, the one you call when you need something to yell at or someone to blame. My dad, Frank, made it abundantly clear over the years that I was never his priority. That spot was reserved for my half-brother, Evan, 24 male, his firstborn and the pride of his life. Me? I was more like an afterthought. Now, Evan's my half-brother from my dad's first marriage to this lady named Marcy. I've never met her, and from what I've heard, she's not exactly winning any parenting awards. She bailed on Evan when he was a baby, leaving him to grow up with my dad. Naturally, Dad overcompensated for Marcy's absence by putting Evan on a pedestal so high, I'm surprised he didn't get altitude sickness. Meanwhile, I came along years later, the result of Dad's second marriage to my mom, Laura, a wonderful woman who, unfortunately, had the misfortune of marrying Frank. Let's talk about Evan for a second. This guy was born with a silver spoon in his mouth and has spent his entire life acting like the world owes him something. He's that guy who thinks he's the protagonist of every story, even when he's clearly the villain. Growing up, Evan treated me like an inconvenience, a pest, something to step over on his way to whatever glory he imagined for himself. And Dad? Oh, Dad encouraged it. He thought it was character building for me to deal with Evan's constant bullying. Boys will be boys, he'd say with a shrug whenever I complained. What a joke. So fast forward to about 6 months ago. I'm gearing up for my final year of high school, dreaming about the day I can finally escape this dysfunctional circus and head off to college. Life at home wasn't great, but I was managing. Then, out of nowhere, Dad calls me into the living room with this big grin on his face like he's about to announce something amazing. Kyle, he says, I've got great news. Evan and his family are moving back in. Now, when he said Evan and his family, he meant Evan, his wife Mia, and their toddler Ethan. I didn't even know how to respond at first. Like, why would Evan, a grown man with a job, a wife, and a kid, move back in with his dad? Turns out Evan had fallen on hard times. Translation: he got fired because he couldn't show up to work on time, and Mia didn't want to get a job because she's a stay-at-home mom. So instead of being adults and figuring out their own living situation, they decided to mooch off Dad. And of course, Dad was thrilled to oblige. Evan moving back in wasn't just a minor inconvenience for me. No, it meant I had to leave. That's right. Frank wanted me to pack up and get out of the house to make room for Evan's little family. According to Dad, Ethan needed a nursery, and Mia needed the guest room. You're 18 now, he said. Like that somehow made it okay to throw me out on the street. I tried to reason with him. Why can't they just take the guest room and leave my room alone? I asked. It was a fair question, but Dad wasn't having it. They need more space, he said. You're practically an adult. It's time for you to stand on your own 2 feet. Stand on my own 2 feet? Are you kidding me? I was still in high school. I wasn't exactly in a position to start renting my own place, but Frank didn't care. He gave me 2 weeks to figure it out, and if I didn't leave by then, he said he'd call the cops on me. I'm not even exaggerating. He literally threatened to call the police on his own son. So there I was, scrambling to find a place to live. I didn't have many options. Most of my friends' parents weren't about to take in an extra teenager, and I didn't have enough money saved up to rent a place on my own. In the end, I called my grandparents, Ruth and Henry, my mom's parents. They were furious when they heard what was happening. Ruth was ready to march over to Dad's house and give him a piece of her mind, but I told her it wasn't worth it. Frank was a lost cause. They came to pick me up in their truck, and I spent a full day packing up my stuff. Frank didn't even say goodbye when I left. He just stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, looking annoyed that I wasn't moving fast enough. Evan and Mia hadn't arrived yet, but I could already imagine the smug look on Evan's face when he walked into my room and saw it empty. Ruth and Henry were absolute gems, kind, supportive, the polar opposite of Frank. But let me tell you, commuting an hour each way to finish high school while living with them wasn't exactly a walk in the park. It's funny though, when you're used to living in chaos, even the most inconvenient situations feel like paradise. So yeah, that's how I got kicked out of my own house to make room for the golden boy and his freeloading family. It was the lowest point of my life, but little did I know, things were about to get a whole lot more interesting, and let me tell you, this story's just getting started. Back at the ranch, aka Dad's house, Evan and his freeloading circus were moving in and settling comfortably into my room. I didn't hear much from Dad, and honestly, that was a blessing. But every once in a while, I'd get an update through the family grapevine, usually from my Aunt Janet, who lives nearby. Janet has no filter, and she delights in gossip, so she was more than happy to spill the tea. According to her, Evan wasted no time making himself at home. My room was turned into a nursery for Ethan, because apparently toddlers need the biggest room in the house, and the guest room became Evan and Mia's private sanctuary. Dad, of course, was bending over backward to make everything perfect for his golden boy. He even bought a new crib, a bunch of toys, and some fancy baby monitor system. Keep in mind, this is the same guy who wouldn't even buy me a skateboard when I was 12 because it was too expensive. But the best part? Evan wasn't just freeloading. He was doubling down on being a pain. See, the reason he and Mia moved back in wasn't just because they wanted free rent, although that was a big part of it. The real reason? Evan got fired from his job at a marketing firm. Turns out, showing up late, missing deadlines, and arguing with your boss isn't a great way to keep a job. Who knew? Mia wasn't exactly helping their situation either. She's one of those influencer mom types. You know, the kind who posts curated Instagram photos of her perfect life while the real world around her is falling apart. She refused to get a job, claiming that being a stay-at-home mom was a full-time gig. I'm not saying parenting isn't hard, but come on. When you're living in someone else's house because you can't pay your bills, maybe consider contributing. Just a thought. Of course, Dad didn't see it that way. In his eyes, Evan and Mia could do no wrong. If anything, he was thrilled to have them back under his roof. According to Aunt Janet, Dad was constantly bragging about how he was helping his family in their time of need, like he was some kind of saint. Meanwhile, I was the ungrateful son who abandoned him. Yeah, because getting kicked out is totally the same as abandoning someone. So, life with Ruth and Henry was pretty peaceful, at least until Evan's freeloading started to ripple out into the rest of the family. It began with little things, like Aunt Janet mentioning that Dad was asking her for money. Apparently, supporting Evan and his family was a bit more expensive than he anticipated. Shocker. Then one day, Ruth got a call from Dad himself. I wasn't home at the time, but when I got back, Ruth looked furious. "Your father called asking for money," she said, shaking her head. "Can you believe that? After what he did to you?" I honestly wasn't surprised. "What did you say?" I asked. "I told him no, of course," Ruth replied. "And I told him he should be ashamed of himself for throwing you out while bending over backward for Evan." I couldn't help but laugh. Ruth might be sweet, but when she's mad, she doesn't hold back. Apparently, Dad didn't take it well and accused her of turning me against him. The man has a gift for missing the point entirely. Meanwhile, Evan's entitlement was reaching new heights. Janet told me about a barbecue Dad hosted a few weeks after Evan moved in. It was supposed to be a small family gathering, but Evan turned it into a full-blown celebration of himself. He spent the entire evening talking about how hard it was to find work in this economy, how Mia was such a great mom, and how they were lucky to have Dad's support. He didn't mention me once, not even to explain why I wasn't there. Janet, being Janet, decided to stir the pot a little. "It's a shame Kyle isn't here," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I bet he'd love to see how you've taken over his room." Evan's response? "Well, Kyle's an adult now. He should be out on his own anyway." I don't know why, but that hit me harder than it should have. It wasn't just the words, it was the sheer audacity of Evan acting like he was somehow above me, like I was the problem and not him. It was infuriating. The final straw came a couple of months later when Dad surprisingly called me. I hadn't spoken to him since I moved out, so I wasn't exactly eager to pick up, but out of curiosity, I answered. "Hey, Kyle," he said, his tone awkward. "How's it going?" Fine," I replied, already suspicious. "What's up?" "Well, I was just wondering, do you think you could help out with something?" Here it comes, I thought. "What kind of help?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "It's just, things are a little tight right now with Evan and Mia here," he began, and I immediately felt my blood pressure rise. "I was wondering if you could maybe ask your grandparents for a little assistance." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You want me to ask Ruth and Henry for money so you can keep supporting Evan?" I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. "Well, it's not just for them," Dad said quickly. "It's for the family." "No, it's for Evan," I shot back. "And you know it." The conversation didn't last much longer. I told him I wasn't going to ask Ruth and Henry for anything, and he hung up in a huff. Later, when I told Ruth about the call, she laughed. "That man has some nerve," she said. "Don't you worry about a thing, Kyle. You're better off without him." She was right, of course. But even so, I couldn't help feeling a mix of anger and sadness. Frank wasn't just a bad dad. He was a bad person. And the worst part? He didn't even realize it. Life went on, and I did my best to focus on school and my future. I thought I'd adjusted to my new normal. It wasn't ideal. Commuting to school was a hassle, and I had to juggle part-time work to save up for college. But it was peaceful. Ruth and Henry were amazing. They didn't just provide a roof over my head, they made me feel like I belonged. But here's the thing. The chaos from my dad's house had a way of creeping back into my life, no matter how far away I was. This time, though, it wasn't about Evan's freeloading or Frank's audacity. It was about Marcus. Now, let me tell you about Marcus. He's the CEO of a mid-sized tech company, a friend of my late mom, and honestly, more of a dad to me than Frank ever was. After my mom Laura passed away, Marcus stayed in touch with me. At first, I thought it was just out of respect for her, but over time, I realized Marcus genuinely cared. He'd check in with me regularly, asking about school, my plans for the future, and if I needed anything. The guy's a class act. When my mom got sick, Marcus was one of the few people who actually showed up to help. He was there for her treatments, helped with the bills, and even arranged a few things at his company, so Frank could work more flexible hours. Frank, of course, used that flexibility to watch football and take naps instead of being there for my mom. Classic Frank. One of the things I appreciated most about Marcus was that he never made me feel like a burden. He didn't smother me or act like he was trying to replace my dad. He just stepped up where Frank failed. After my mom passed, Marcus told me, "If you ever need anything, Kyle, my door's always open." And he meant it. Over the years, Marcus became the person I turned to when I needed advice or just someone to talk to. When I was applying for colleges, he helped me navigate the process. When I got my part-time job, he taught me how to budget. And when Frank kicked me out, Marcus was one of the first people I told. "I'm not surprised," Marcus said at the time. "Your dad's always been short-sighted, but don't let his choices hold you back, Kyle. You're better than that." His support meant the world to me, especially because I didn't have much of it from anyone else in my immediate family. Sure, Ruth and Henry were great, but Marcus understood what it was like to deal with Frank on a deeper level. After all, he was technically Frank's boss. That's right, Frank worked for Marcus. Or at least he did until recently. Now let's fast forward to the day everything started unraveling. I was at school, going through the motions of another exhausting day, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "Hey Kyle, can we talk later? Something's come up and I think you should know about it." I didn't think much of it at first. Marcus was the type to keep me in the loop about things, so I figured it was just a casual check-in. But when we finally talked, I realized it was anything but casual. "Kyle," he said, his tone serious. "There's been an incident involving your dad and Evan." Great. Just what I needed. More drama from those two. "What happened?" I asked, bracing myself. Marcus sighed. "Evan's been stealing from the company." Wait, what? I knew Evan was entitled and lazy, but I didn't think he'd be dumb enough to steal. "Are you serious?" I asked. "What did he do?" "Over the past few months, he's been skimming money from client accounts," Marcus explained. "It's not a small amount either. We're talking thousands of dollars. And to make matters worse, your dad vouched for him when we hired him. Now Frank's under suspicion too." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Evan was always pulling stunts, but this was next level. And Frank? He might not have been directly involved, but he definitely enabled Evan's behavior. Marcus hadn't reported them yet. He could have gone straight to the police, but out of respect for my mom, he was holding off. "I wanted to give them a chance to make it right," he said, "but they're running out of time. If they don't pay back what they stole, I won't have a choice." I was furious, but also weirdly vindicated. For years, Frank had treated Evan like he could do no wrong, and now it was blowing up in his face. I thanked Marcus for letting me know, and told him I'd keep him updated if Frank or Evan reached out to me. Sure enough, it didn't take long for Frank and Evan to come crawling. A few days later, they showed up at Ruth and Henry's house unannounced. I was in the middle of studying when Ruth called me to the living room. "Your dad's here," she said, her tone dripping with annoyance. I walked in to find Frank and Evan sitting on the couch, looking desperate. It was the first time I'd seen them in months, and honestly, they looked like crap. Evan's usual smugness was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made him look like a kid caught stealing cookies. Frank, on the other hand, looked defeated, like he knew he'd screwed up but wasn't ready to admit it. "Kyle," Frank started, his voice shaky, "we need your help." I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "With what?" "It's about Marcus," Evan said, jumping in. "You're close to him, right? He likes you. He trusts you." "Yeah, so?" I asked, already knowing where this was going. Evan hesitated, glancing at Frank for backup. "We need you to talk to him," Frank said. "Convince him that this was all a misunderstanding. Tell him we were using the money for your college fund or something." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You want me to lie for you?" I asked, my voice rising. "After everything you've done to me?" It's not lying, Frank said quickly. It's bending the truth. Kyle, we're family. Family helps each other. Funny, I said, laughing bitterly. Because you've never helped me. You threw me out to make room for Evan, remember? Frank had the audacity to look hurt, like I was the bad guy here. That was different, he said. This is serious. If Marcus doesn't believe us, we could go to jail. I stared at them for a moment, taking it all in. The desperation, the entitlement, the sheer audacity of their request. Then I said the one thing they didn't want to hear. No. Their reactions were priceless. Evan's face turned red, and Frank started stammering, trying to guilt-trip me. Kyle, please, he begged. Don't do this. You're my son. Yeah, I said. But you've never acted like my dad. I'm not going to help you. End of discussion. After walking out on Frank and Evan's ridiculous request, I was feeling a mix of emotions. On one hand, it was satisfying to finally stand up to them after years of being their punching bag. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the sheer audacity of their scheme. They seriously thought I'd swoop in and save them with some bogus story about a college fund? Unbelievable. The next couple of days were quiet, or so I thought. Frank wasn't about to let me off the hook that easily. Sure enough, my phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. It was Frank. Kyle, we really need to talk. This is serious. Please call me. I rolled my eyes and ignored it. But Frank wasn't done. He started calling from different numbers, leaving voicemail after voicemail. They all followed the same script. Guilt trips, desperate pleas, and a sprinkle of, "You're my son, Kyle. Family helps family." I blocked every number he used. I was done. If he and Evan wanted to weasel their way out of this mess, they'd have to do it without me. But Frank was persistent. When he couldn't get through to me, he tried going through Ruth and Henry. One evening, while I was upstairs studying, Ruth called me into the kitchen. "Kyle," she said, her tone tight, "your father left a message on the landline." Of course he did. "What did he say?" I asked. "He wants us to convince you to help him," Ruth replied. "He says they're in big trouble, and you're the only one who can fix it." I let out a bitter laugh. "Fix it? He's delusional." Henry, who was sipping coffee at the table, chimed in. "You're not getting involved in this nonsense, are you?" "Not a chance," I said. "They're on their own." Ruth sighed. "Good, because whatever mess they've made, it's not your responsibility, and it's certainly not ours." A few days later, Evan decided to try his luck. I was at work when he showed up at Ruth and Henry's house, unannounced. Ruth called me after he left to fill me in. "That boy has no shame," she said. "He came here, all smug, thinking he could charm us into convincing you." I could practically hear the disdain in her voice. "What did he say?" I asked. "He claimed it was all a misunderstanding," Ruth explained. "Said Marcus was overreacting and that you could clear things up if you just talked to him." "And what did you say?" "I told him to leave before I called the police," Ruth said with a huff. "I'm too old to deal with this kind of nonsense." Bless Ruth. She wasn't about to let anyone drag me into Frank and Evan's mess. Still, their persistence was starting to get under my skin. It wasn't just annoying, it was insulting. Did they really think they could guilt me into risking my own future for their crimes? Meanwhile, Marcus and I stayed in touch. He'd call every so often to update me on the situation. According to him, Frank and Evan were scrambling. They'd promised to pay back the stolen money, but hadn't delivered a single cent. Time was running out, and Marcus was losing patience. "I've given them every opportunity to fix this," Marcus said during one of our calls. "But they're not taking it seriously. If they don't come up with the money soon, I'll have no choice but to involve the authorities." "Do what you have to do," I told him. "They made their bed." Marcus sighed. "I know, Kyle, but it's frustrating. Your mom always tried to see the best in people, and I guess I'm trying to honor that. But there's only so much I can do." Hearing Marcus talk about my mom hit me harder than I expected. She was the glue that held our family together, the one who always believed people could change. But Frank and Evan had taken her kindness for granted. They didn't deserve Marcus's patience, and they certainly didn't deserve mine. The breaking point came when Frank showed up at Ruth and Henry's house himself. I was out with friends when it happened, so I only heard about it after the fact. Ruth was furious. "Your father has some nerve," she said when I got home. "He barged in here, uninvited, demanding to speak with you." "What did you do?" I asked, half expecting to hear that she'd thrown a rolling pin at him. "I told him to leave," Ruth replied. "He refused, so I called Marcus." "Wait, what? You called Marcus?" "Yes," Ruth said. "I told him what your father was doing and asked if he could step in. Marcus said he'd handle it. I didn't know whether to laugh or be impressed. Ruth wasn't playing around. And Marcus? He wasn't either." A few days later, Marcus called me with an update. "Kyle, I've spoken to your father," he said. "I made it clear that his behavior is unacceptable. If he contacts you or your grandparents again, he'll face legal consequences." I felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone was holding Frank accountable. "Thanks, Marcus," I said. I appreciate it. Don't thank me yet, Marcus replied. Your father's not out of the woods. If they don't pay back the money, I'll have no choice but to file charges. That wasn't my problem, though. So, after Marcus put the hammer down on Frank and Evan, you'd think they'd get the message and start cleaning up their mess. Well, they didn't. Instead, they doubled down on their stupidity, trying to scheme their way out of the hole they dug. But here's the thing. When you spend your whole life stepping on people, karma eventually comes around, and I was more than happy to give it a little nudge. At this point, I'd already decided I was done with them. I'd blocked Frank and Evan on every platform, warned Ruth and Henry to stay vigilant, and focused on moving forward. But even when you try to distance yourself from drama, drama has a way of finding you, especially when you've got people like Frank and Evan in your orbit. One day, Marcus called me with some news that made my jaw drop. Kyle, he said, I've discovered something new about your brother. Do I even want to know? I asked, already bracing for the worst. Marcus chuckled dryly. Probably not, but here it is anyway. Evan wasn't just skimming money from the company. He was also using a company credit card for personal expenses. Oh, for the love of... What was he buying? I asked, half laughing at the absurdity. Luxury items, Marcus replied. Watches, designer clothes, even a set of golf clubs. The man's been living like he's still making six figures. I couldn't help but laugh. Evan's entitlement knew no bounds. Not only had he been stealing, but he'd been flaunting it like he was the star of a reality show. And now the receipts were piling up. Literally. Marcus was done playing nice. I've given them every chance to make this right, he said. But they've ignored every warning. It's time to take this to the next level. I didn't have to ask what that meant. Marcus was gearing up to file charges. And honestly, I couldn't blame him. Frank and Evan had treated his generosity like a blank check, and now they were about to face the consequences. Still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't enough. They'd spent years making my life hell. It was time for them to understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end. That's when I had an idea. You see, Evan had always been obsessed with his image. He wanted people to think he was successful, charming, and untouchable. The truth, of course, was the opposite. So I decided to hit him where it hurt the most, his reputation. Step 1 was gathering evidence. Marcus had already shared some of the details with me, but I knew there was more out there. With his blessing, I started digging. I found old emails, expense reports, and even a few social media posts where Evan had bragged about his business success while posing with items he'd clearly bought with stolen money. The dude couldn't help himself. Step 2 was telling the story. I wasn't about to post a public takedown or anything, but I knew there were key people in Evan's life who needed to know the truth. First on the list, Mia. Now, Mia and I were never close, but I'd always felt bad for her. She married Evan thinking she was getting Prince Charming, only to end up with a freeloading con artist. I figured she deserved to know the full extent of his lies, so I sent her a carefully worded email with all the receipts. It didn't take long for her to reply. Thank you for telling me this, she wrote. I knew Evan was struggling, but I had no idea it was this bad. Ethan and I are staying with my parents now. I don't think we'll be coming back. Well, that was one bridge burned. Evan's family was officially out of the picture. But I wasn't done yet. Next on my list were some of Evan's old friends, the ones he used to hang out with back when he was still pretending to be a hotshot. These were people who'd always bought into his act, cheering him on like he was the second coming of Steve Jobs. I figured they'd be interested to know the truth, so I sent a few anonymous messages with links to the evidence. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within days, Evan was a pariah. His friends stopped returning his calls, his social media accounts went dark, and word started spreading through our extended family. Aunt Janet, of course, was the first to call me about it. Kyle, have you heard about Evan? She asked, her voice dripping with excitement. Yeah, I've heard, I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. Well, let me tell you, everyone's talking about it, Janet said. He's ruined, Kyle. Absolutely ruined. I could hear the glee in her voice, and I couldn't help but smile. For once, it felt like the universe was on my side. Meanwhile, Marcus officially filed charges against Frank and Evan. The legal process was slow, but the damage was already done. Frank lost his job, his reputation, and most of his friends. Evan, on the other hand, was scrambling to figure out how to pay back the stolen money. Probably won't and will end up in jail soon. While dealing with the fallout from his shattered social life, it was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. Ruth and Henry, ever the voices of reason, reminded me not to dwell too much on their downfall. Focus on your own success, Kyle, Ruth said one evening. That's the best revenge you can have. She was right, of course, but I couldn't help feeling a little satisfied, knowing that Frank and Evan were finally facing the consequences of their actions. As for me, life was finally looking up. With Marcus's help, I landed a paid internship at his company, which was a huge step toward building my future. Ruth and Henry continued to support me, both emotionally and financially, as I prepared for college. And for the first time in years, I felt free from the weight of Frank and Evan's toxicity. Looking back, I realized that their downfall wasn't just about karma, it was about reclaiming my power. For years, they'd treated me like I was nothing. But now, I was the one in control. And let me tell you, it felt damn good. Evan and Frank may have thought they could skate through life without consequences, but the truth always catches up with people like them. In the end, they weren't just exposed, they were defeated. And me? I came out of it stronger, smarter, and ready to take on the world. If that's not a victory, I don't know what is.